Hello everyone, and thanks for watching. Welcome to another session of Ask Lyngdorf, which we will do several times a year. And the last one was called Going Deep, and that was about subwoofers and LFE. And my plan was to call this one Going High and talk about immersive speakers. But we received so many questions about how to set up an actual MP40, MP50, MP60 that I moved this topic forward. So today this will be about setting up a Lyngdorf multi-channel processor, and we will look deeper into the menu settings. Questions came in which were quite advanced, and some questions were very basic, so I hope I find a good balance for all of you. And we have picked some questions from Facebook, from Instagram, and also from our form on the website and contact from our support team. So I think it's a good mix. So thanks already for reaching out and putting on all these questions. Let's start with a very general one, and that is what to do first. What to do first when setting up a new Lyngdorf MP. And that goes for MP40, MP50, MP60, because the menus are the same. And for this, it's really important to understand the menu on the left side as a sequence, as an order, what to do and what to do next. So this little screenshot here shows you the first menu, and you really understand that you first can set the sources, then you do speakers and room, and then you do all the others. And if you press speakers and room, just another screenshot here, then you find this speaker setup first, verify speakers, adjust sub, room perfect, and channel gain. We will go through this in this session. But it's really important to understand this is step by step. It's a sequence. So don't go backwards. Start with the speaker setup and work step by step to the bottom of this menu list. So let's look at the first questions. For example, from JR, what is your recommended speaker setup to start with? Or what's the best standard speaker setup? Do I need to place the speakers according to one Dolby Atmos or DTS or RO system? And well, this does not really depend on the MP40 or MP60 or on Lyngdorf or on us, but really on your home cinema room layout and your loudspeakers and how many channels you can afford. So these questions are a little bit difficult to answer because that's very individual and very different from system to system. And it's not really on us to give you the best advice on your specific home cinema and setup. Luckily, Dolby makes a very good guideline where everything is described from 5.1 to, well, actually from 2.1 to 5.1 to 7.1.2 to 7 point or 9.1.4 and 11 point something. So everything is in there, and luckily every DTS setup aligns or matches to these Dolby setups. So your MP40 or MP60 does not really determine how to set up the speakers in the best way. That is something. It really depends on your speakers and your subwoofer. Does that mean you can combine any speaker combination you like? No, and therefore I have a matching next question, which came from Henrik. Why can't I save my chosen speaker setup? I cannot save. I cannot click the save button. And this will happen if it does not meet the configurations or it's not certified by Dolby or DTS. And then you cannot save it. It's a so-called invalid setup. So let's look into the menu here. We go into setup. We go into speakers in room and speaker setup. Here we have set up a fairly normal 5.1 setup. And to give you one example, what is not allowed, what doesn't comply with the Dolby or DTS settings is we go to edit. I will, just to give an example, remove the surround speakers, set to none. And now, for example, you could not just add back speakers or rear speakers. You can do that here. Just let's put on 2 large ones. But you can see invalid setup, and the save button is not activated. You cannot save the setup because this is not a Dolby surround system, a proper Dolby surround speaker setup to have front speaker, center speaker, LFE, and only back speakers. You can simply not save it, and that has nothing to do with the MP40 or that we don't like it. It's really not according to any Dolby system. Once you add the surround speakers in this case, then you can save it again. Another example. In this case here, I put on 2 back speakers or rear speakers. I can also remove these here to none again. For example, if I say I have a center speaker here, a back center. So far so good, but to give you another example, what is not possible, if I then think I want a center rear and also a pair of rear speakers next to it, this is again an invalid setup. It's not possible because it's not according to, well, this Dolby rulebook. Let's remove that one here. Set it to none. Another example is if I would remove the subwoofer. Let's say you want to start with a 5 or 7 channel system and you have large front speakers and you don't have a subwoofer yet. Again, this is an invalid setup because the LFE signal has to be played by some kind of loudspeaker. So in this case, this is not, you cannot save this. So in this case, you either have to add a subwoofer or change the speakers to XXL, because then the LFE channel or signal will be redirected to the front speakers, and you can see in the menu here you can save it. Let's add one LFE again for later. So of course you can do a lot of different speaker setups here, but some setups are not allowed and you cannot save it. What also is not covered here in the speaker setup menu is the actual upmixing to the channels. That is also defined in the processor, which is defined by Dolby, DTS and Auro. So whatever kind of speaker setup you save here, the actual signal that you hear from the speakers is not set here because that is predefined by the processor or algorithms from that. A related question from Daddy is, would you suggest a center channel at top of the screen? Would there be a lip sync issue and how can this be overcome? This is something, it's a good question at this point, simply because the distance and the exact placement in your room, so the measured distance to the speaker, is not done here in this menu, but comes later when we talk about Room Perfect in the sequence in the menu. So that anything like distance and so is not set here. Let's move to a different question, another question. Also related to this one is, which is the ideal speaker size? We kind of covered this in the last Ask Lyngdorf session, which you can find on YouTube. How the speaker size also is related to the subwoofer size and the subwoofer performance. So again, it's not really on us, on Lyngdorf or and the MP40, MP60, what is the best speaker size for your speaker, because Room Perfect will kind of make the best out of a given setup here, but it's not really on us to define or to specify or to give advice what your speakers, how your speakers perform the best. Most loudspeakers benefit from setting them to large, just to relieve them from the lowest bass, say from 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hertz, and let them play fully in their comfort zone, which we covered in that first session. And all remaining bass then will be redirected to the subwoofer or subwoofers with a crossover slope of 24 dB. But as I said in that first session, make sure that your subwoofer is ready for it, is capable of taking up all the bass. Because if you set every speaker to large or medium, then it can be 5 or 7 or even 9 or more speakers redirecting bass to your subwoofer. So you better make sure that your subwoofer is able to do that. So if we go into the menu again, we can set up the speakers, for example, to large, and then you see the roll-off here, and that is redirected to the subwoofer. Okay, let's move to our next question, which is, what is the best LFE cutoff frequency recommendation? I have an active subwoofer for LFE. Is sub 80 the correct setting in the MP40? I'm assuming all crossovers are done in the MP60, and the sub settings should be left as in THX. And that is a good question, because in the speaker setup, you really only take care of what the speakers are like, not yet what the subwoofer should cover. So let's go back in the menu again. And we have set one subwoofer here. And if we click on Edit again, you can see you can set an LFE channel cutoff. And that is the low pass of the LFE. It's very important that you understand this menu setting as for what is written. LFE channel cutoff. That's only for the low frequency effect signal. So how much of that incoming LFE signal from the soundtrack should be covered by your subwoofer? So what is the best setting for this one? It's kind of independent from what your speaker setup is like, because this is the LFE signal. If you set the LFE channel cutoff to 80, that sounds alright, because you've read about THX and 80 Hertz and so on very often. But I like to show you a few screenshots or graphs where we advise for a slightly higher setup. Let's look at one here. So this graph shows you what the LFE can cover according to a Dolby soundtrack or DTS soundtrack. So of course in most movies it's more around 80 Hertz and then not much happening, but in theory in some movies it can go up to 100 or even 120 Hertz. So meaning in our next graph here, if I set it to cut off 80 Hertz, there's a roll-off beginning around 80 Hertz. So this, as you can see, would not cover all the LFE signals that might be on a soundtrack. If we go a little bit higher to 100, you can see it covers more, but only if we set it to, for example, 125, so sub 125 in our menu, then you can see this really covers the complete LFE signal. And that is our recommended setup for the LFE. Again, make sure that your subwoofer can handle this, but that's another topic. But if you ask about what's the best setting, well, the best setting is that it really covers what can be on the LFE soundtrack. As you can see, this is more about sound performance. And sound performance also brings us to our next question, which can really limit your bass performance, maybe even without really knowing it. And that question is, what is the subwoofer delay setting for? It's very easy to ignore this, because you might say delay, I don't want a delay, so I put this to 0, and but it's very important. So let's have a look at the menu again. If we click on Edit and go into the LFE, you can see that there is an LFE amplifier delay in milliseconds. And as the word amplifier delay already indicates, this is not a delay in distance. This is really a delay of the amplifier. And here you set a delay of the processing time of your subwoofer. So To give you some examples, this can be from a Class D amplifier. This can be whenever the amplifier or the subwoofer has some kind of DSP, signal processing, then there will be a signal delay. It will be some kind of delay in reference to the main speakers. And in this setting here, you can take care of that. So two things you have to do. First of all, you have to find out the signal delay of your loudspeakers, of your amplifier. And second, you have to find out the signal delay of your subwoofer or amplifier of the subwoofer. If you don't find it in the small prints, ask the manufacturer, because every Class D or DSP based amplifier or subwoofer will have a kind of signal delay or latency. So let's look at 3 examples here. So one is a subwoofer which is quite powerful, and it has a signal delay or latency of 0.8 milliseconds. Now 0.8 milliseconds is not so much in the long wavelengths of a subwoofer, but it's still something, and why not take care of it? Why not put it in? So in this case, you would put in 0.8 milliseconds as the signal delay of your LFE of your subwoofer, and then it's totally in time with your main speakers again. I have another example here, which is a Class D design, and there the signal delay or the latency is much longer. It's 2.7 milliseconds because there was a DSP, there's a DSP involved, and a lot of filtering and a lot of other things. So that latency is quite long, and that can be covered in the settings of an MP40, MP60. Another example of this one here, again, a very capable subwoofer, but it has 2 milliseconds latency, and that can be covered here. So again, this is not any distance or delay because of any distance. This is really because of signal delay or processing delay or latency in the subwoofer. So let's add something here, for example, 2 milliseconds, and save done. And now your subwoofer is totally in sync, time-wise, phase-wise, with the main speakers. And that is very important. Let's move over to the main speakers, because also in the main speakers we have these kind of settings. One very often asked questions is gain, delay, EQ. What are all these speaker settings for? So let's go back to the menu again. Let's go in one of the speakers. Basically, the setting is similar for all the speakers, and you will see several points here to set. One of it is gain. Now, this is not the gain if you want any of the surround channels or front channels louder than the other. Remember, we are not yet here in the sound tuning or how you want the sound be in the room. This is about setting your loudspeakers and the amplifiers of your loudspeakers. So this gain setting is, for example, if you have different amplifiers for your speakers in your system. And if one amplifier is much louder or has much higher sensitivity than the others, then you could address that in the gain settings here. That's what it is for. If all your amplifiers in the system for the front speakers, for the round speakers, for the height speakers are the same, you don't have to do anything here. But if you know that some amplifiers are different or louder than others, then you adjust this here in the gain settings. Then again, we will find amplifier delay. This is the same what I just explained for the subwoofer. If you know that some of your amplifiers have a delay which is different to another amplifier, then you have to address it here. If all your amplifiers are the same, you don't have to do any delay in here, even if they have, because it's in relation to the other amplifiers. One example is we had one case where someone had Class AB amplifiers for the left and right speakers, and later he added another amplifier because he expanded his system to a surround system, and he added a Class D amplifier for the center speaker. But every Class D amplifier has a slight signal delay. So his left and right Class AB amplifiers had zero delay or latency, and the Class D amplifier had a slight latency. So of course the front and the center speaker were slightly out of phase with each other in time. So it's very important, if you have different amplifiers, check the delay, check the latency, and put it in here. Another thing you can do is select EQ. So select EQ is you can, well, normally you can leave this alone, because this is really an EQ if you want to change the sound character of your speaker and you already know it. Normally you can trust the loudspeaker designer that they did a good job, and you don't have to put on a different EQ on top of that. So my recommendation is to leave this alone, unless you have a speaker where the speaker manufacturer recommends to put on a certain EQ. One example is you can choose here under EQ also presets for Lyngdorf speakers. For example, you can choose an LS1000 in the front, and then you can have MH as surround speakers and BW20 as the subwoofers or woofers, and then there will be automatically a slight EQing and the best setup for the MP40. But apart from that, you can set this, leave this alone. Also because you don't know yet how it will sound like. So I would never put any EQ here before you've even done Room Perfect and finished the setup and listened to a few movies or music. Then you know that you can do something, but that I would do in the voicing, which we will come to later, and not here in the EQ. So better leave the EQ on neutral. Then we can see some other settings here. Use natural roll-off. If you click yes, you can see even though we have specified large speakers, you can see now that signal or that setting uses the natural crossover filter of the loudspeaker. So if you have large floor standers, you can set it to its natural roll-off if your speaker is capable of that. And the large speaker settings, which we put in here in the menu, of course, that missing low frequency, it will still be taken and put into the subwoofer. So you will have kind of both, if that makes sense in some setups, to use natural roll-off for the, in this case, front speakers, and still put that bass and redirect it to the LFE. Another option here is bi-amping. This, of course, does what it says. You can have bi-amping, for example, if you have a bi-amp speaker, or even if you have two speakers on the front and use it bi-amped, you can use it both with the same signal, or you can put in active crossover here, so a high pass and a low pass for these. Okay, that's it. That's the speaker setup and the speaker settings, or I should say speaker settings and amplifier settings, because it's really both. And the next step in the menu, remember it's top down, is verify speakers. So in the menu we have speaker setup, and then we have verify speakers. And verify speakers, you can really test or check that you have done the right connection to the right wiring. It will play a signal through every channel, and you simply listen that you've done the right thing and connected it the right way. Then the next step in the menu is adjust sub, and for that we have received the questions, which comes quite often by Josef. Can you explain adjust sub setting for me? And by Dennis, why do I need adjust sub? Isn't Room Perfect adjusting the sub? First of all, don't jump the step. Again, it's a sequence and you have to go through one by one. And of course, Room Perfect will align the subwoofer with the main speakers later, and it will also match the subwoofer acoustically to your room. But still it needs to know what your subwoofer is capable of, or what the amplifier is capable of, and how loud it plays in reference to the main speakers. And that's what this adjust sub setting is for. So Room Perfect has the chance to align it within reasonable volume level and not to overpower the subwoofer, and also not let it perform much below its capabilities. So you really get the best from it when you do adjust sub. When you go to the menu, speakers and room, you have done speaker setup, verify speakers, and here is adjust sub. So when you press start, what will happen, and I have a screenshot or photo for you, it will play a reference tone. But it's very important, and you can also read that in the manual, but it's over and overlooked. Very important, it first plays a sound on your front left speaker, and then it plays a signal on your subwoofer. So it plays a kind of reference signal on that speaker, and then it plays on the subwoofer, and then the next step is it will be measured by the microphone. It will tell you to probably raise the volume level, and you raise the volume level on your subwoofer. So on the back of your amplifier, of your subwoofer, or by remote control or whatever. You don't raise the level on your MP40 or MP60. You do it on your subwoofer, so it's on level or aligned with the volume level of your loudspeakers, which probably have a different amplifier. So that's very important. And then at one point the menu will say OK, and then you can save it, and then Room Perfect has the best chance to align everything in the best way together. So next point in the menu down is Room Perfect, and there's a question which came by Scott, by Andre, and by Kenneth. Should I do Room Perfect before or after the speaker setup? And I guess you know my answer. It's a sequence from top to bottom. So don't jump to Room Perfect and then change some settings. You have to let Room Perfect know what your speakers are like, how many speakers are there in the room, what your subwoofer is like, delays of your amplifiers, processing delays, and so on. And only then Room Perfect makes sense, because Room Perfect is not a kind of speaker calibration only. It is really something about room acoustics and matching your loudspeakers and the subwoofer to the room. And for that, of course, Room Perfect has to know the best or everything about your speakers and about your setup. So let's look at this Room Perfect menu here. I have to say we will talk about Room Perfect in a separate session, because we could easily talk 1 hour about Room Perfect alone. So I have to move that to later. But when you click on Room Perfect, you will see that you have to put in the distance to the speakers and to the subwoofers, and that is always done best and most precise by a laser tool. That is the very best here, and then you put in the distance here, and then you run Room Perfect. That also brings me back to one of the earlier questions about lip sync and distance to the center speaker. If the center speaker is way above the screen, for example, that's what you put in here. So that is the distance to the center, and if the distance is further because the center is higher or other speakers, that is where everything will be aligned in the right distance and delay in that sense. With woofers, subwoofers, it's a good trick to not measure just to the enclosure front baffle, but to measure at least to the cone or even to the back of the enclosure, which is a good acoustic trick to really make it match very well. And again, Room Perfect we will definitely cover in a separate session. After you have done Room Perfect, don't go backwards. So don't change the EQ of the speakers, don't change the delay of the amplifiers, don't change from large speakers to small speakers or try different setups. Room Perfect doesn't know that you've changed it. So Room Perfect takes this first setup as it is, and don't go backwards in the menu. That's very, very important. Some people have also added Atmos speakers later without doing a new Room Perfect calibration. and that is going backwards. So if you have a new speaker setup, then you have to do a new calibration based on the new speaker setup. Okay, there's one more step after Room Perfect, which you find in this drop-down menu, and that is gain. And we have a matching question from Scott. What is the channel gain for? It's important that this is not about the amplifier or speaker gain, which we saw earlier in the speaker setup, but this is according to the DTS or Dolby soundtrack. Usually you can leave this gain setting alone, but it might be that after Room Perfect, after everything is set right, you listen to some movies, you listen to some soundtracks, and you think, I prefer the center speaker to be a little bit louder. And then you can adjust this in the gain settings here. So if we look into the menu, we can click on channel gain and click on edit, and then you can basically edit every speaker that you have in the menu individually. But again, you have to listen first. So even though this is the next step in the lineup in the menu, it's a fine-tuning tool. So you have to listen first, to know what you want. And what you want might be that you want the center speaker louder, that you want the surrounds louder, that you want a bit more immersive sound from the ceiling speakers. That is what you can address here. But don't go crazy here. So this is stepping out of what Room Perfect has already aligned for you together with the room. So do fine adjustment steps. Do it in 0.5 decibel, listen again. Do it if you want in 1 decibel step and listen again if that's enough for you. Because again, you are overwriting Room Perfect a little bit, at least on this channel here. So again, it's a fine-tuning tool. And of course, keep in mind, if you put in plus 10 dB, you will not get more or higher volume level overall. It will just reduce your headroom. So of course, you will not make your amplifiers more powerful or make your loudspeakers more powerful or your subwoofer. It just costs you headroom. It will not give you more performance altogether. Okay. Further down the menu, there are audio settings, and here we received another question from Andrew. What do the dynamic range controls do in the audio processing, and what is the best setting? Well, dynamic range, or DRC, is another word for the infamous compression. So it compresses the dynamic range so that loud sequences are not as loud and quiet sequences are not as quiet anymore. Some people call it night mode. So then, apart from that, some people don't like the compression. That's why you can disable it. It might make sense in late night listening. So the dialogues are a bit more audible. And when there are, as I said, loud sequences, it's never too loud. And we have different settings for DTS and Dolby. For the purist, keep it off. But it can be useful, for example, late at night. In the same menu, and that's the final question for today. What does DTS remapping mean? This came from Gaurav. And this is part of the capable DTS remapping engine. And it's a kind of upmixing for soundtracks. For example, if it's a 5.1 soundtrack and you have rear speakers in 7.1 or 9.1, it will play or engage the rear speakers in 7.1, 9.1, even though you have 5.1 content. So it's a kind of upmixing. Now, after all these settings is done, it's very important that you save all these settings. So in the menu here, after you've gone through speaker setup, verify speakers, adjust subroom, perfect channel gain, and you've done the audio setup, it's a very good idea to go onto manage software and save a backup on the SD card or on USB stick, because whatever you set, if you do some changes later that don't work out well or you're not happy with the changes, you can always go back and load the backup from the point when everything was said and done. So that's a very good idea, and you can give the backup a name. You tell it to backup September or backup December, and then you will always find it, and then you can always go back to. And that backup also includes the room perfect measurement. So whatever you do after this, you can change a lot and always go back. Okay. Time to digest all these settings. I know there are some open questions about Room Perfect and also about voicings, which we didn't cover here. That calls for an extra session, and very likely Room Perfect will be the next one. So you can already post your questions about that for an upcoming session. Thanks for being with us in this session. Hope to see you again. Thank you, and bye-bye.